Welcome to Eminent Psychotherapists Revealed. We are pleased to feature Jeffrey Barnett, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Loyola University, Maryland, and a licensed psychologist board certified by the American Board of Professional Psychology and Clinical Psychology, and in clinical child and adolescent psychology. He is also a distinguished practitioner in psychology of the National Academies of Practice. Among his many professional activities, Dr. Barnett is a past chair of the ethics committees of the APA, the American Board of Professional Psychology, and the Maryland Psychological Association. He previously served on the Maryland Board of Examiners of Psychologists and has been a consultant to licensing boards across a range of health professions. He has published 13 books and over 250 articles and book chapters, and has given over 500 presentations and continuing education workshops for mental health clinicians, each of which focus on ethics, legal, professional practice issues for psychologists and other mental health professionals. So now that we've talked you up, welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Let's kick it off with what got you interested in pursuing the field and the world of psychology.
Well, I was a standard run-of-the-mill pre-med biology major in college, miserable, didn't really enjoy it, and basically just happened to sign up for the intro psych class as sort of an elective, just needing to meet a requirement. And the weekend before the course started, I purchased the textbook, and then I started flipping through it, and then I started reading it, and I didn't go to sleep all weekend and read the whole book, and went in Monday morning to my advisor and changed my major to psychology.
Wow.
And then after taking intro psych, basically took 3 or 4 psych classes every semester to do the whole major in a short time. And
immediately sold.
Fell in love with it, and just loved everything about it and every course I took, and did independent research and had an opportunity to be a teaching assistant as an undergrad twice, and then several other, fun activities, and just seeing what psychology was like, and just loved it. And so it just, sort of like this passion for the field of psychology. And then following, getting done with college, the standard question of, well, what are you going to do now? And it's like, well, I guess I should go to grad school. And to me, grad school was a similar thing of like, there's just so much to the field of psychology, and even just say clinical psychology, but even there, it's so many different things, and you can't do it all. But I've just always have found it, just so interesting and engaging and invigorating and fascinating, and I've enjoyed all the experiences I've had thus far.
Wow. So compared to what you were studying originally, you were like, this is way more interesting. I'm passionate about this. That's a great story.
Your worry is like, well, will I ever find something that I like? Or what if I'm never happy? And then it just happens, and you just know that it's right.
It's a wonderful feeling.
And now, I've been licensed as a psychologist for almost 40 years now, and it's been a great career, and I'm still enjoying it. So it's made a good decision.
Clearly. What got you specifically into more of the ethical piece to it? Was there anything that, made your focus turn to that in some way?
Sure. So interestingly, I had a part-time position at a state hospital in addition to my private practice early in my career. And the chief psychologist there, my direct supervisor, was on the State Psychological Association's ethics committee. And she was just happened to be in the hallway talking about it. And I just thought it was interesting. And she said, oh yeah, she's rotating off the committee, and they're probably gonna have to get someone else. And I'm like, oh really? How does one get onto the committee? How does that work? And so, you just have to be nominated by a current member. Oh really? How about me? And so I just thought it sounded interesting. And when I got on it, it was primarily investigations and adjudication, and really didn't have a focus back then years ago on prevention or on education. And that just stood out to me. And so one of the early meetings of the committee, I just said, wouldn't it be a great idea? Couldn't we have like a question and answer column in the newsletter on ethics? And they said, great idea, go do that. And in the beginning, no one had questions. So I just made up the questions, and then I made up the answers and did that for a while. And then I said, well, what if we had like brief articles on different ethics topics? There's so much people need to learn about. And they said, great idea, go do it. And, then it was like, we should also, do like ethics workshops, for members of the association. And it's like, again, everything's a great idea, go do it.
Right.
And you think I'd learn to stop suggesting things,
Right.
but they were all things that I enjoyed. If it's good stuff, you want to do it.
Right. Right. So you
And
developed a lot of that.
Yeah, and then one thing led to another, and just I was writing these brief articles in our state psychological association newsletter on different ethics issues for practitioners, and all the executive officers of the state associations get to read these, and one of them was the editor of a book, an annual, and said, "Oh, would you be interested in expanding this into a chapter for our book this year?" I'm like, sure, I've never done that before, but I'll give it a try. And then I did another, and then, then just one opportunity sort of led to another. And it became a student of ethics and learning more about it and thinking more deeply about it. And something that's developed over the years, but really a focus much more on prevention and education as opposed to investigations and adjudication.
That makes sense. So it's turned more towards how can we just not have these things happen in the first place.
That would be the goal. That's desirable.
Makes sense. Yeah.
It's not 100% successful, as I learned serving on my state's licensing board and being a consultant for other professions licensing boards. Sometimes these things do happen. And one of the roles that I serve in and have for many years is when a professional is mandated by their licensing board to have certain actions to maintain their license. It can be an individual ethics tutorial, so I regularly do those. It could be a mandated supervision for a period of time, and I do that as well. And again, so sometimes we try to prevent ethical mishaps or difficulties, but when it's not possible, I really believe strongly that rather than take a punitive approach, if at all possible, we want to try to rehabilitate or do remediation, and typically additional training and supervision is much more helpful than just some punitive action where no one's going to learn anything anyway. That's not helpful.
Right. That makes sense. Well, welcome, Barbara.
Hi, I'm sorry I'm late.
Thank you.
I'm changing my name from Jeffrey to Barbara.
We can have two Jeffreys. That's nice.
That's okay.
So years ago, Jeffrey Magnavita and I were on the board of APA's Division of Psychotherapy, and there were 3 other Jeffreys on the board at the same time. So that we had Jeffrey 1 through 5 in terms of how we referred to ourselves. Yes. But it was a very powerful board and was very effective.
Very effective, I'm sure.
Did a lot of good Jeffrey work.
A lot of Jeffrey work.
So you in some ways are like Jeffrey 1.
Which one is 1 though?
That's me.
Father.
Ah, of course.
I know him before this Jeffrey. There's something about it, the perkiness. And, but you were talking about what you've been doing recently, and you were talking about telehealth. And obviously we're doing telehealth right now. I'm wondering what kinds of pluses and minuses you've discovered through it. You hear they're going to try to retract a lot of this, limit its ability to go across state lines. You're going to have to spend a certain amount of time face to face in the office, or else you won't be able to bill or something. What do you think about these things?
Well, so interestingly, the vast majority of mental health professionals and health professionals in general were more or less forced into practicing telehealth with the onset of the pandemic. And prior to that, very, very few professionals provided telehealth. I was actually involved in it for over 30 years. In the military, the VA, the Public Health Service have used telehealth for many, many years, for decades. And to me, it's not an all or nothing type of thing. So when you're in rural practice, and whether it's either there's not adequate access to needed services because you're just in a remote area, for example, or maybe there is a professional, a provider who's available, but because it's this small, isolated, insular community, there's such a close prior relationship that to have them be your treating professional isn't really appropriate, and you need someone out of the community. I mean, no one's going to drive 5 hours to have a session and 5 hours back. That's just not feasible or realistic. And so to be able to have a telemental health session just creates greater access to care. It's cost effective. There's so much research that's been coming out in the past decade or so showing how many different presenting issues and different types of people can be treated effectively via telehealth. Obviously, all technologies are not created equal, and I sort of have a hierarchy in my mind of video conferencing is number one, telephone is number two, emails number three, and text messaging is number four. And so I know there are these business models for doing email counseling, and there's no evidence base for that. And it's not psychotherapy, it's not counseling, it's something, it is a service, and people can give advice and speak to each other, and but it's not the same. But with video conferencing, there are numerous studies that show the ability to create a meaningful therapeutic alliance and working relationship is more or less equivalent to in-person. And for many people, it can be extremely helpful and effective. So, some people lack adequate transportation. Some have reasons why they, just can't access services in person, geographic reasons and others, or they need specialized services that aren't available in the local area. So I think every potential client or prospective client needs to be evaluated for the appropriateness of treatment with telehealth or telemental health, and then they need to be evaluated for the specific technology that we're planning to use. And it's not one size fits all.
No, what would you say the kind of limits of it are? Where shouldn't it be used?
Well, several limitations have to do with technology. So, you can have lapses in the technology. Certainly, there are people who don't have adequate internet service, and they might not be able to do video conferencing. Another issue is some people might have much more emergent needs, and they might need partial hospitalization or inpatient, or someone who's actively suicidal. We might have to assess, is it appropriate for them? The other thing is, like right now you can see my torso, but you can't tell if I'm so nervous that I'm picking at my cuticles or my knee is bouncing up and down. And if we were doing telephone as opposed to video, then you lose visual cues. You don't really see things. And then when we get to email or texting, you don't even have auditory. So, I mean, I can type in an email to someone, "How are you today?" And they can type in FINE, and that could be fine, or it could be fine, or anything in between. So you lose a lot, and so I think video conferencing is preferred if we're going to do telemental health.
I have a bias in that I think actually it's much more powerful than non-video, because it makes you see yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You see yourself as well as the person you're working with, and seeing yourself is often the hardest thing patients can do. So you're over that hump. They'll fight you for months.
But that's voluntary. Excuse me, Michael. That's voluntary, because on video conferencing like now, we could turn off our self view and not see ourselves.
Right.
But in a therapy session, if you're saying you could turn yourself off. You don't have to look.
The camera that we would view, that we wouldn't see ourselves, we'd only see the patient or client. But in general, we would, unless you consciously decide to turn it off, we can see ourselves.
You'd know that video was turned off by the little head with a line drawn through it.
Yeah.
So,
let me just tell you one other thing that's really vital that I'm thinking of as you're asking these questions, we're discussing this, is even the idea of isolation. So when everyone went from being in an office and maybe there's colleagues and between clients, you pop your head in and chat and all those interactions. If you're working from home on your computer, it's much more isolating. And they talk about Zoom fatigue, and just, sitting sitting and looking at a monitor all day, not being around colleagues, that can be an issue that, clinicians really need to think about and address. And, how am I, reaching out to others and, being part of a community of colleagues and using, whether there's consultation or just, social interactions, but, focusing on self-care and combating isolation, I think is really important as well.
So that you've said the magic word now, the self-care is what you've been working on recently. And I wondered if you'd elaborate on what you're doing.
Sure. So initially, when we think in terms of self-care and in the media in general, in our society, people think in terms of like, oh, I do meditation, I do bubble baths with, soft music and candles, or whatever it might be, yoga. And those are great. And those can be a part of one's self-care plan. And interestingly, the ethics code for psychology talks about how we have to attend to our physical and emotional functioning and well-being. And when it becomes evident to us that we're experiencing difficulties, we need to take corrective action. The problem with that is our ability to become aware of it. And there's so much research, and there's something called the Kruger-Dunning effect. And it basically is we're notoriously poor at self-assessment, and that the more impaired our functioning is, the more impaired our assessment abilities for ourselves are as well. And so the direction I and some of my colleagues have moved in over the years is a communitarian approach, where we are responsible for each other. We look out for each other, and we accept that, sure, some of self-care is individual. So I go for a run, or I go swim, or I do whatever I do for myself, but that's necessary but insufficient. And it's vital that we include others, and we need others' accurate assessments and feedback. And we need others we're looking out for them and they're looking out for us, and what we call a competence constellation. And the idea that we have colleagues where maybe we meet once every 2 weeks or once a month, a small group of colleagues, and it's not psychotherapy, it's not supervision even, it might be more of pure support. And we talk about anything. You talk about your work, your personal life, your fears, your concerns, planning for retirement, problems with your family, relationships, with everything, and we have to be open and honest about it and acknowledge that everyone struggles, everyone experiences distress. We're all at risk of developing burnout if we're not careful, and we need each other to look out for each other, kind of point out if we look like we're struggling in some way, and maybe make suggestions for potential positive actions to take, but to not rely on ourselves individually to do it all. And interestingly, the ethics codes for other mental health professions like social work and professional counselors, as well as nursing and physicians and others, include this communitarian approach. And the APA ethics code for psychologists is currently undergoing a major revision and overhaul. And the ethics code revision task force is aware of these issues. We've shared feedback with them. We've even submitted proposed wording changes for specific standards to address this issue, because as of right now, the ethics code requires us to be sufficiently aware of our own issues and struggles. And we have biases and we have blind spots, and it just, the research shows we're not able to do that. So the hope is to really have much more of this team-oriented communitarian approach to this. And then that involves some trust in each other and some vulnerability, and being comfortable with that and understanding and accepting that we're all in it together and we all need this.
That's so interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for the LICSW licensing that I was talking about earlier, that I recently took, I do think most of the questions were about specifically, ethics, but also if you notice a coworker is doing something unethical, what do you do? And the answer is to first talk to them.
Right.
which is interesting. Before you do anything else, you first talk to them. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. Maybe they don't know, they're not aware, they're not a good judge of their own self in that moment. So that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and people, we all have struggles in our lives. And so, let's just say I've experienced a loss in my life and so I'm grieving. Well, how do I determine, do I need to take time off? Am I okay going back to work on Monday morning? Where do you draw the line? And we're not good at determining that. It's just, no one is. And it's not a flaw or defect. It doesn't mean we should be embarrassed or ashamed. It's universal. And we need to consult with our caring professional colleagues and say, here's what I'm going through and what do you think? And do you have any recommendations or what are your suggestions? And because so much of, as you mentioned it with ethics, so much of it is not black and white, it's all in the gray areas. And, I don't know where the rule or the line is for, okay, if you have, on the grief scale, if you're at a 72 or above, you need to take 2 days off. Or if it's more or less, here's what you do. And it's so personalized. And so just to be able to have these open discussions with colleagues who care about us and who will be supportive and helpful, and that we can be open and unguarded with, and trusting, then we can help. With their help, we can make good decisions. Because obviously our ultimate goal is the welfare of the patients or clients that we're treating. And so a lot of this self-care revolves around our clinical competence and effectiveness and how they're vulnerable to all the stresses and challenges in our personal lives and our professional lives and the interaction between the two.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I don't think that's typically what comes to mind when people think of self-care. It's the bubble baths and the other stuff that you were saying
Right.
before, and this kind of peer support with colleagues can be a really huge way to get some self-care.
And so one of the things that's interesting is that so often in our culture, in our society, and even for anyone who's a mental health professional, the things that got you to where you are was hard work. And everyone's used to in grad school, who brags about, oh, I pulled an all-nighter, or I worked this number of hours, or I didn't do anything all weekend and got that paper done. And another part of my work is on creating a culture of self-care. And so I tell all my students, I don't want and even supervisees, but I don't want anyone bragging about, I didn't take a break for 3 days, or I didn't sleep, or I want to hear, what'd you do this weekend for you? What'd you do for relaxation? How did you take care of yourself? I'll ask students like, okay, who binged Netflix this weekend? And because if you're not doing those things, but we have to normalize it. We have to make people not feel ashamed to take care of themselves. And it's not all about just hard work, because,
Well, there's no question that, we get raised in a certain way. And most of us, it's to work hard. And if you don't work hard, you're a loafer and you're not pulling your share.
Right.
And you can't be, you're not supposed to be weak. You're not supposed to be needy. You're supposed to just, take it one for the Gipper and keep on going. And so it's really a total change in how you function for much of your life. My wife is still telling me, could you sit down and just relax? I said, why do you always have to work?
Yeah. And so obviously the name of the game is balance. I'm not suggesting people don't work and shouldn't be successful, but and balance is a moving target. It's different for each person and it's different for each of us over time. There's no one rule, like this is the right balance. It's like, I don't know what the right balance is for everyone. And, my balance during the summer is different than during finals week, or, when I have a deadline for a project. But, we have to keep that in mind. But we're socialized that it's hard work. And, I think when I was talking about being vulnerable, being open, being honest, it's acknowledging our humanness and saying, I'm really struggling with this, or I'm having a hard time with that. And that's hard to do. That doesn't feel right.
Excuse me, in our Q&A, someone is asking if you can name the research phenomenon again that
Oh, it's
you
called the
mentioned.
Kruger-Dunning effect, and there are numerous studies, Dunning et al. You know, and if again, I can share the specific stuff, but you know, I can, if there's a way of sharing, you know, I can share specific articles with people. But if you know, if anyone even just went online and looked under my name, you know, in terms of publications, they would see articles that address this approach, and we cite all that research in there.
Yeah. I'd like, since I have the floor, I would like to ask you about, and I apologize if you covered this before I came on, but I'm really interested in the teaching of ethics to graduate students and, you know, entry practicum students.
Oh, sure.
And I'm just curious, are there any particular ethical principles that you found especially challenging for beginning therapists?
I think the most challenging thing frequently is that you can't just look at the ethics code and it'll tell you what to do. That I try to explain, if you think in terms of the normal distribution, you know, this is a 2.2% at one end where everyone agree, yep, unethical, bad, don't do it. And then 2.2% at the other extreme, wonderful, great, do it. And then the vast majority is in the middle, the gray areas. And the answer is, it depends. And this whole thought process of applying an ethical decision-making approach or model and how to think and reason through things and how to reason and think ethically is really the goal. No one needs to memorize the licensing law or the ethics code. And even the ethics codes even say, you know, this is not intended to replace your judgment or decision-making. It's, you know, it needs to be augmented with that. And you know, how we apply the code. No ethics code can tell you what to do in every situation that'll ever arise during one's career. And so really, you know, early in one's training, it's like, well, just tell me where to look it up, you know, and it's like, I can teach you the basic principles, we can review the standards, and, you know, this sort of the ethical floor, don't fall below that, here are the bad things, don't do them. But above that, this aspirational approach, what's called positive or aspirational ethics, which really asks, you know, what's the best I can do? And in every situation, there's not one right answer. You know, there are multiple options. You know, I always teach them to ask questions like, you know, what options and alternatives are reasonably available to me in this situation? And what are the relative risks and benefits for each? And who might be impacted and so on? And to really get them thinking in terms of this deliberative, thoughtful decision-making process, as opposed to looking for the right answer, because there could be lots of appropriate answers depending on circumstances. And I use a lot of vignettes and dilemmas that we kind of talk about, and you can see how there could be multiple potential courses of action depending on different factors, as opposed to, let me look it up, you know. So hopefully that answers your question.
Well, that gives it, that's a meta answer, but it's a very good one, because
okay, thanks.
I think also some of the forces working against that, and maybe Lizzie can talk about this, but students preparing for exams, or, you know, like students going into an oral clinical competence exam, and these examiners are often just looking for the, you know, the rote understanding. You agree? And you know, also when there's a supervisor training somebody, and the supervisor's license is at risk, if their supervisee makes some kind of mistake, then they might not be encouraging the kind of decision making that you're talking about. But I totally agree with what you're saying.
I mean, I do feel that everyone needs to know the content of the code of ethics and the content of your licensing law and the regulations that accompany it. And so if, like, for my graduate students, I have a take-home assignment that they do, and I have these like 20 little vignettes, and for each one, then I list underneath it all these different sections of the ethics code, principles, standards, laws and regulations, and just a whole smattering of different ones. And they have to, based on this vignette one, click on which ones are violated. And so by doing that, I'm getting them to read the ethics code, read the law repeatedly, because they're looking. So if it has to do with a vignette of, let's say it involves, this is one that's in there. So, you use the WISC-R, which is a child intelligence test from the 1980s that's been revised 4 times, but you use the WISC-R to screen an older adult patient for dementia, and it has other things in there about no informed consent and not confidential and all these different problems that are in there. And then they have to, for each one of these standards, they have to go look it up and say, let me read this. Is that violated? Yes or no? And let me read this one. Is that violated? Yes or no? And so by using the code and applying it, they'll become familiar with the content. And it's open book, it's untimed, it's take home, there's no memorization. I want them to be familiar with the ethics code, familiar with their licensing law and regulations, and learn how to apply them. And then that's phase 1. Then phase 2 is where we have these more complicated vignettes where we just have these open discussions, about how would you address this? How would you approach it? What are the relevant principles? What are the standards? What are your options? What are the pros and cons? Who might be impacted? How, things like that. And I understand not all exams are like that, but that's my approach. So when I was on my state's licensing board, we changed the state. There's like the national board exam, the EPPP in psychology, but then our state had a state jurisprudence exam, and originally that was like an essay exam, and then they made it a multiple choice exam. But I lobbied and advocated for changing it to just make it open book, and because it's not about can you memorize the definition of X or Y, it's about can you apply it, because that's what we do in practice, is we apply the code, we apply the standards. And so we changed it, and there was no increase in unethical behavior. It actually went down. It's like, lo and behold, instead of forcing people to memorize things that they're going to forget the next day, but have them learn to apply it, that worked. Go figure.
I said earlier I was going to ask you about the things that you found most useful for the people you treat in general, the kind of techniques that you find really make a difference as you grow and try more and more things, teach more and more people. Mm-hmm. Have you found that there are particular areas and interventions that are more useful than standard?
Well, there's several ways I can answer this. I'll say several things. The first one is, like, all of my grad students and trainees and me when I was early in my career, there's this need to do something, like to do a technique. I need to give them something. They're paying money for this. I need to make this worth their while. I have to do some techniques on them. And so often, if you do any kind of assessments where the patient or client fills out a form about, what did you find most helpful about this session? What did you find least helpful? What are your goals? What do you hope your therapist would know and learn, and this and that? Typically, the things that the clinician thought were most helpful, the patient thought were least helpful. And when the clinician just sat there, said nothing, just listened, let the patient think, ponder, sit with what they're dealing with, be uncomfortable, whatever, they found that most helpful. And so early on, learning, get away from this need to just, the more techniques I do, the better it is, or they need techniques from me, and to realize how the relationship is just so crucial. Sure. And, this deep, caring, compassionate, supportive relationship, and being fully present in it, I just feel it's just so powerful. And it's not all we do. And obviously I use techniques at different times, but the techniques are in the context of that kind of relationship, as opposed to, I think when I first started out, and I think many people who are early in their training, it's sort of inverse. It's like the technique focus.
You don't know what to do. I mean, you've been demonstrating this deeply caring, empathic approach from the beginning. You know, I'm wondering, how do you get people to leave your office?
Well, we have goals that we agree to, and I mean, I use techniques, and I'll give homework and things like that, and I'll summarize. I'll say, well, I see we're getting close to the end, so I just want to review what we've accomplished today and what our plan is, and it's so the other thing is, it's interesting. You're taught every session is 50 minutes or 45 minutes, and that's it, and stick with it. And there's nothing magical about that. And I have some people I'd see for 90 minutes, and some people, I've had clients where it was like, we met for 30 minutes and we're like, okay, I think we've accomplished what we wanted to, so that's okay. Or, certainly over time, I'll have clients go from weekly to every other week to every third week or fourth week. And I have some clients who are really like, I just want to have a booster session, so they'll contact me. And it doesn't have to be so rigid, but when we're first starting out, it's like, tell me the rules and I'll follow them, or give me the manual and I'll do what it says. And
sure.
So we learn to trust ourselves more, I think. And I know you've spoken about self-disclosure and being more open and genuine and human, as opposed to, I think in the beginning when I first started out, it's like, almost like hiding behind the veneer, the role of the psychotherapist, and feeling comfort in that. But I think, we're people, we're persons, and connecting on a human level is important. And it doesn't mean I spend the whole session talking about my vacation plans. Obviously, anything that I disclose needs to be relevant to the goals of treatment. But there are times when, a self-disclosure can be a really powerful and meaningful intervention, or times when touch can be really valuable and important, done appropriately, or, to extend the time of a session because someone's in crisis is an appropriate thing to do, rather than say, oh, no, the rule says 50 minutes, we have to end here. I think that can be more harmful than the good we're trying to do by, following the rules. So I think with more experience, we learn to trust ourselves more and get greater perspective on things.
We have a question in our Q&A, but I think you may be answering it in part.
No, go right ahead.
I'm curious if you have had an evolution in relation to models of therapy.
Oh, great question. So I went to a graduate school that was very psychodynamically oriented. It was all ego psychology, Kernberg, Kohut, object relations, all that sort of stuff. And I had a full scholarship to graduate school through the government called the Health Professions Scholarship Program, where I was basically in the reserves in the Army, and each summer went on active duty for 6 weeks and did an externship at an Army Medical Center or military training, and then did my APA approved internship year at an Army Medical Center. And then I did an additional 4 years as an active duty Army psychologist. And in the military, it was all brief treatment, cognitive behavioral, very time limited and focused. And it's like, what do I do with all this? When I'm in grad school, it's all, psychodynamic, and, and here it's very cognitive behavioral. And while I was in graduate school, I was exposed to the work of a psychologist, Paul Wachtel, who is one of the early founders of integrative psychotherapy, and read his books, and, through APA, got to, go to his presentations and, so on and so forth, and really learning how, I can conceptualize people psychodynamically, and that's valuable, but I don't have to do psychodynamic psychotherapy. I can still, if someone's coming in with a, specific issue that needs to be addressed, and we have a limited amount of time to do that, I can, do cognitive behavioral work with them, and it can be helpful, and, have different goals. But, I struggle with this idea of like, what's right and how do you do this? And then to be told there's something called integrative psychotherapy, and it wasn't technical eclecticism. It wasn't just like, pick a technique and do what you want. There's a theoretical basis for what one does, but you don't have to just do only this or only that. And so that definitely has evolved. And then the other big thing was my early training in cognitive behavioral therapy was very much in line with, again, as we were talking about techniques, and what I put in the category of sort of manualized treatments. And I really learned over the years, again, it's still relationship based. I mean, cognitive behavioral therapy still is done in the context of a meaningful relationship with a good therapeutic alliance or working relationship. And that was part of the evolution for me as well, because just the idea of the techniques only just didn't make sense to me. And it took time to kind of learn how to integrate all this and kind of the best of different parts of this to create something that would meet the needs of this individual before me. And this not a one size fits all approach, of course.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I have a question that I've just been dying to ask.
Good.
Last night I did a webinar on how to build your private practice.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize it was about how to build your private practice through social media. Now, I was taught that social media, being on there, having patients see that, any of it, Facebook, whatever it is not good. We don't want it. We've avoided it. And now everyone is getting patients from Instagram or Facebook groups and all these other things. What do you think about that as a ethics expert?
So this is actually something that I give trainings on and write about. So it's a timely topic. And social media is pretty much ubiquitous, and it's a big part of people's lives. And it's how many people establish and maintain relationships in their lives. And so if people do that in their lives in general, it's very possible that they're going to expect their clinician to do that with them as well. And that can create some challenges. And it's, there's boundaries and multiple relationship kind of issues, therapist transparency, self-disclosure. So if you think of like, what do you typically share, post, and disclose in your personal social media account? Is that something you'd want clients to have access to? But if you have a business or professional social media account that's separate and you're using that for marketing your practice, that I think can be totally appropriate. And because the thing, you're not posting pictures of your kids and your vacation and the family reunion and all that sort of stuff. It's all professional. And so the notion of having a personal social media presence and having used the highest possible security settings and being very careful about who you accept in, that's really important. But then to use the social media as a means for both advertising and marketing, and even have a blog, So I have colleagues like say, so you create a website for your practice, and on there you maybe post brief articles or tip sheets that you create, and you have a blog and that's posted there, but also people access it other places. And like, in essence, many years ago when I first started out, they had the yellow pages and people would take out an ad, or you have an ad in a paper or whatever, or magazine. Well, everything's online now. And so what is your online presence? And interestingly, I mean, research shows that the vast majority of all members of the public search for healthcare related information online, whether it's learning about issues, finding resources, or finding providers, professionals. So even something like Psychology Today, if people want to find a clinician, that's where they'll frequently go and read people's profiles, and then it'll take them to the website and they'll see what else is there. And then they'll maybe call them. So to have a social media presence can be really helpful, an online presence, but it's not your personal one from your personal life. So if I have Facebook or whatever I might have, or Instagram, and it's, or even on my website, I'm posting like, here's a video of a presentation I gave, and here's an announcement about an event in the community, and here are tip sheets for managing ADHD or depression or relationship issues or whatever, providing online resources. Because if people in the online world see me as an expert and they like my presence and the way I talk or the way I interact and so on, they say, oh, that seems like someone who I feel comfortable with, or that's someone I think who could help me, then they're going to contact us. But again, I just see that really different than what people do in their personal lives with social media.
So there's a really thick line between the personal and the business side to it. Yeah.
Yeah, because in our professional roles, we talk about informed consent. And one of the things that I write about and include in trainings is that we have to have an electronic communications policy, which includes a social media policy. So that, for example, I do not participate in social media at all with patients or clients. It's just, I don't do it, but that doesn't mean I might not do it in my personal life. But, I have to think, well, how might that change the clinical or the therapeutic relationship? Is this becoming more of a friendship or social relationship, and what kinds of things get shared? And also, most patients or clients don't understand is that there's threats to their privacy, that, if I accept someone into my social media network, everyone in that network now is interacting with them and knows them and is going to discover, who they are. And it's not like some private confidential thing. The other big issue is that each social media platform, each company that creates these, has access to everything in your computer, in your device. And so when we talk about security settings, that's between us and other users. There are no security settings between us and the company that created this platform. And their business is not social media. Their business is mining and selling our data so that companies can market to us to make more money. And most users don't understand that. And, if you've ever signed up for something and they have like the user agreement and you have to click I accept, and you look at it like, oh my gosh, you need a team of 30 attorneys to interpret this. I'll just accept it.
Sure.
But in there it says, and we have access to your address book and your hard drive and all your messaging and everything. And we can use it for any purposes we want, to include marketing and selling your data. And they all do that. That's their business model. But most clients don't understand that. And so since we're so focused on confidentiality, I feel like it's really important for me not to engage my patients or clients in the personal social media. Again, the professional is different because no personal information is being disclosed.
Right.
Speaking of social media, would it ever be, this has come up in conversations, would it ever be ethical for a therapist to do a Google search on a client and try and find as much information as they can?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a good bit that's been written about that my perspective on this, and many people who write about this, is that unless you've included in your informed consent agreement that you retain the right to search online for information about your client, you should never do it. Because, as has been written for many years, trust is the cornerstone of the counseling relationship. And so if I search for something about, it's like I have a client and I'm treating them for an addiction and they're saying how great they're doing. I'm like, I don't really believe this. I think they're exaggerating. Let me go search online, and I see like pictures of them, partying and drinking and this and that. What do I now do with that information? If I say, I saw online this week you doing this, how might that impact trust and the relationship I have? So, if I happen to inadvertently just discover something about a patient, like if, for example, on the front page of my newspaper, it says local teacher accused of such and such, and it's one of my patients, at the next session, I'm going to say, I saw this in the newspaper, I'm going to mention it. But that's different than me doing a search behind their back. And then what do I do with the information? Do I just hold it in my head? And if I have to keep straight, what things have they told me, and what things am I authorized to know, and what things did I discover on my own without permission? And I just feel like if you really want to have the right to search for things online, and maybe in some kinds of treatment programs that might be relevant, that should be part of the informed consent, and clients need to know in advance that that's something you have the right to do. And if they don't agree to it, then obviously you cannot do that. But I just feel like doing that without permission is, I just feel like that's not consistent with the types of trusting, caring relationships we're trying to have with our clients. I think it violates that trust.
Yes.
Does that make sense, the way I'm
Yeah,
putting it?
totally. I agree. This has come up, but I'm just saying it's sort of creepy. It would be like in the pre-internet days, stalking your clients,
Sure.
kind of driving around and following them and seeing what they're doing. So,
but now with the internet, people are just so used to just searching for everything online. So it feels like, oh, well, we all do this. I'll just search for that, or I'll just look up this about this person. But we have a different responsibility than our clients have. If they want to look stuff up about us online, they can. But for us to look things up about them, again, I think I've addressed why I feel the way I do about that.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question about really anything in the field that you're excited about or really curious about or really focused on right now. You talked about the self-care piece. That was awesome. But is there anything else in addition to that?
So, I mean, in my general area of ethics, so, I mean, it's evolved and there's different phases of my career that I focus on different things. So there's a big phase I had of focusing on boundaries and multiple relationships. And I think that's really important. And now with everything online, online multiple relationships, I think are a challenge. And, historically with boundaries and multiple relationships, there's a very rigid approach and very focused on staying out of hot water and don't do anything. And my approach has been to focus on, with boundaries, they can either be avoided, crossed, or violated. And to cross a boundary by definition means it's clinically relevant, welcomed by the client, not contraindicated, consistent with the goals of treatment, consistent with relevant diversity and individual differences, and so on. And a boundary violation is unethical, inappropriate, unwelcome, harmful, and all that. But to try to avoid all boundaries and say, I'm just never going to do anything, I'll never extend the time of a session. Well, that's not appropriate. There are times when you should. It depends on why you're doing it. If I'm extending the time of a session because I'm really attracted to a client and want to spend more time getting to know them, that's really different than they're in crisis, so I extend the time of a session. Or, the location of where the session occurs, or we talked about self-disclosure or gifts, sure, some gifts are inappropriate to accept and it shouldn't happen. Some kinds of multiple relationships should be avoided, but to have these absolute rules, just aren't helpful. And so learning how to, again, decision making and how to, apply a thoughtful process to that's important. And then, telemental health, telepsychology has been a big area lately. And just I think in terms of the whole self-care area that we talked about, I think that's really an emerging area that's just so important. And again, this willingness to acknowledge when we're struggling and to seek help. I think I remember early in my career, the idea of like, I don't want to admit I'm having problems. I might get in trouble or someone might report me. And so great, I'll just pretend I don't have problems and brush it away and not deal with it so that, it's like, and you think about logically, okay, so wait, so I have these difficulties, but I'm going to avoid dealing with them because I don't want to be viewed negatively or have consequences. So I'll pretend they're not there and let them grow and get worse. And it's like, yeah, how's that going to turn out? And so to learn to be okay with that, and to create this culture of self-care and have a supportive network of colleagues and to be vulnerable. And it doesn't mean I'm, show up at a session and tell a client about having, relationship difficulties or financial problems or whatever it is, but I have to talk with someone. I can't just have this image of, the strong, self-confident and independent person who can handle everything. It's not realistic for us, but also, I see myself as a role model. What am I modeling for my clients? What am I modeling for my students? Ignoring issues and pretending it's all okay. And, I just don't think that's helpful. So
I mean, you don't know everything.
I truly don't. I'm still learning.
Yeah.
And that's the other interesting thing, you remind me of is like, one of the things I've really been thinking about a lot lately is my impending retirement. And my whole concept of retirement has changed so much as the years have gone by. And it used to be like, you work to a certain point so you can retire. And then I've learned it's like, well, you have to retire to something. It's like to just stop working makes no sense. What would I do? I'd be bored. And now it's like, well, I love what I'm doing. Why would I retire? And I get to do all this. I have balance and I do the fun things I want to do. And, so I don't know, my way of thinking about this has continually evolved. And now it's like, well, I'm sure I'll retire at some time, but as of now, I have no plans. And as long as I'm enjoying it and doing a good job, and as long as, cognitively and physically I'm fine, why stop? So we'll see.
Yeah.
Laughing, by the way, because this is my first year of retirement.
Ah, well, here you are
And
doing this. So you're
I'm
still
going back-
engaged and doing interesting things. So
Yeah,
that's
this
good.
is my one little hobby. I'm keeping my finger in. But back when you said about self-care is streaming Netflix, I think retirement is streaming Netflix all the time without any
New
guilt.
retirement.
Right,
Love it.
that is.
You know, I know there's some people in some fields where they don't really love what they're doing and they just putting their years in so that they're eligible to retire. You know, they just can't wait. And, you know, I understand that. And that's a different situation. And obviously we don't have this physical demanding work that, you know, you're broken and you can't physically do the work anymore. So, you know, as long as cognitively and emotionally I'm capable, if I'm enjoying it, and again, as long as my competence is good, and again, I don't get to decide that, colleagues have to give me feedback on that. But then I'll continue, and as long as, you know, I can. And I mean, that's a new way of thinking about it for me. That's evolved for sure.
Well, you don't have to worry, you'll be able to fake it.
Ah.
You're plenty smart enough.
Well, it's true that if the more you have when you start, as you're losing it, you know, you're better off.
It's not fair. It's not fair.
But I'm still, yeah, the funny thing is, one of the things I push myself to do is writing articles or book chapters and giving presentations and things like that, it's sort of like how they talk about, you know, do crossword puzzles or Sudoku, you know, do things to stimulate yourself. I find the work that I have to do to write an article, it's on the one hand, it's so hard and challenging, but it's also so enjoyable and rewarding. It's like this kind of combined thing there. And I feel like that just keeps me current and, you know, on the cutting edge and not stagnating. And, you know, I don't want to be, that's the way I think is, I don't want to become obsolete, you know, so I feel like I have to keep learning and moving forward, so that doesn't happen.
I have one more final question for you. Just a heads up, we have 4 minutes before we wrap up. For those of you who are watching, feel free to stay on. We'll just finish up the conversation before we all go. But my last question is, what advice would you give for young professionals in the field? Give it something good.
Yeah, seek out a great mentor. Don't have to do it on your own. And mentoring is different than supervision or different than psychotherapy. Now, you could have your supervisor, if you're in supervision, a supervisor could become a mentor, but not necessarily. But to have really good mentoring relationships in your life, and don't sit back waiting for some mentor to say, hey, I've seen your work and I'd really like to help you out or support you or mentor you. I mean, you have to feel like, you know, if you see someone, you contact them, send them an email, introduce yourself, you know, you go to a conference, walk up at the end and talk to them. And, you know, can I take you for a cup of coffee? I'd love to talk to you more. And, you know, just kind of, many high-level professionals love mentoring. This generative stage of our careers of giving back, and it's very rewarding to be a mentor. It's bi-directional in terms of its benefits, and so, you know, don't feel like you just do it on your own. And, you know, because, you know, again, if you're in an independent practice, it's very independent, and I just feel like having different mentoring relationships in your life, and, you know, one is not enough, and each one offers something different, and they don't all last forever, and maybe you get new ones at different points in your career. But if I have to advise anything, if I pick one thing, that would be one. There could be lots of other good things one could do, you know.
In the spirit of honoring the great mentors, are there any particular people that you stand out?
So I'm still in very close contact, and I actually spoke to him earlier today, my intro psych professor from undergrad.
Wow.
He and I are still very close. I received a very high level APA award like 12 or 14 years ago, and he and his wife flew into DC to go to the conference, to be there for when I received the award. I've visited him several times, and he and I still keep in touch. And, you know, he gave me my start, you know, all these opportunities. And but I've had numerous others, you know, throughout my career. I don't know, I can drop names, but Pat DeLeon through APA, a past president, Dorothy Cantor, Ron Fox, You know, these are people who have been, through my involvement in APA over the years, who've just been great mentors and role models, you know, but, you know, I think everyone needs mentors, and everyone hopefully can be a mentor, you know, for others at different times, you know, and
I love that.
I just see value to that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's great advice. All right, I'm gonna go find a mentor right away.
Mhm.
For those of you who
Perfect
are
way to
watching,
end.
Thank
yes,
you so
yeah,
much.
that's
This is
it
a great-
for the recording here. So please feel free to stay on and listen to us as we wrap up. Yeah, so thank you, Jeffrey, so much for coming, but don't
Thanks.
go. Don't go.
Thanks for
Don't
having
go.
me.
This
It was
is
fun.
great, though. It's really
Perfect.
enjoyable.
Oh,
But now
good.
we have informal, unrecorded